Let's look at the various tools of the Federal Reserve to influence the money supply. As you may remember from the last lecture, the Federal Reserve has 4 tools to manipulate the money supply. First off, it can manipulate the required reserve ratio, that is the amount of cash that the bank needs to have in its vaults or at the Federal Reserve. The Federal Open Market Committee operations, that is the buying and selling of bonds. The federal funds rate, which is the interest rate charged by a bank to lend funds to another bank. And finally, the discount rate, the interest rate that the Federal Reserve charges banks to borrow from it. Let's look at the changes in the reserve requirement and how they impact the money supply. Let's look and see how changes in the reserve requirement influence the money supply. As you may remember, a bank has a balance sheet with assets and liabilities. The Federal Reserve sets the reserve ratio for a bank. In our example, the Federal Reserve requires that the bank keep 10% of its deposits as a reserve. In our example, the bank has $2,000 in deposits and so therefore is required to keep $200 in required reserves. If the Federal Reserve increases the reserve ratio from 10 to 20%, then the bank will need to transfer $200 from its excess reserves, money that it uses to make loans, to required reserves. The Federal Reserve has decreased the amount of money available to the country in 2 ways. First, it has decreased the money multiplier by 1/2. Before the change in the reserve ratio, the bank multiplier was 1 divided by 10% or 1 divided by 0.010, which gives a bank multiplier of 10. With a bank multiplier of 10, any loans that the bank makes will increase the money supply by a factor of 10. After the change in reserve ratio, the bank multiplier was divided by 20% or 1 divided by 2/10, which gives a bank multiplier of 5. With a bank multiplier of 5, any loans made by the bank increases the money supply by only a factor of 5. Since the bank multiplier has decreased in size, loans made by the banks generate less money for the economy at large. Second, notice the amount of excess reserves has decreased from $300 to $100. This means that only $500 of new money can be created through the banking system instead of 3,000. Let's see what happens when the Federal Reserve rate decreases the reserve ratio. As you may know, the bank has a balance sheet with assets and liabilities. The Federal Reserve sets the reserve ratio for the bank. In our example, the Federal Reserve Bank requires that the bank keep 10% of its deposits as a reserve. In our example, our bank has $2,000 in deposits and therefore is required to keep $200 in required reserves. This creates a total of $3,000 of additional money in the economy if the bank is able to loan out its excess reserves. If the Federal Reserve decreases the reserve ratio to 5%, 2 things happen. First, it has increased the bank multiplier by 2. Before the change in the reserve ratio, the bank multiplier was 1 divided by 10% or 1 divided by 1/10, which gives a bank multiplier of 10. With a bank multiplier of 10, any loans that the bank made increased the money supply by a factor of 10. After the change in the reserve ratio, the bank multiplier was 1 divided by 5% or 1 divided by 1/500th, which gives a bank multiplier of 20. With a bank multiplier of 20, any loans made by the bank will increase the money supply by a factor of 20. Since the bank multiplier has increased in size, loans made by the bank generate more money for the economy. Notice that the amount of excess reserves has increased from $300 to $400. This means that $8,000 of new money is created through the banking system instead of $3,000. This is almost 2.5 times the amount of money that was created with the 10% reserve requirement. In conclusion, when the Federal Reserve increases the reserve ratio, the amount of additional money declines because the higher reserve ratio means less excess reserves and a lower bank multiplier. When the Federal Reserve decreases the reserve ratio, the amount of money created increases because the lower reserve ratio means more excess reserves and a higher bank multiplier. Our next subject that we're going to look at is bonds. Bonds are important because they are tools used by the Federal Open Market Committee to influence the money supply. So before looking at how the Federal Open Market Committee influences the money supply, let us look at bonds in some detail. A bond is a promise to pay back a given amount of money sometime in the future. Bonds have ratings to attest to their creditworthiness of the borrower. Bonds carry with them a face value of a given amount of money which will be paid back at a given time. So for example, a bond might have a face value of $100 to be paid back in 1 year. Here's an example of a typical Treasury bond bought by investors and the Federal Reserve. The U.S. Treasury also issues bonds in smaller amounts for average people to buy. These are called United States savings bonds. Bonds are rated principally by two companies, Moody's Investment Services and Standard & Poor's. The slide outlines Standard & Poor's rating system. A AAA rating means extremely strong capacity to meet financial commitments. It's the highest rating. AA is very strong with capacity to meet commitments. A is strong capacity to meet financial requirements, but somewhat susceptible to adverse economic conditions and changes in circumstances. B++ is considered the highest speculative grade by market participants. BB, less vulnerable in near term but faces major ongoing uncertainties to adverse business and social conditions. B, even more vulnerable to adverse business and financial and economic conditions, but the capacity has to meet most financial commitments. CCC is currently vulnerable and dependent on favorable business, financial, and economic conditions to meet financial commitments. CC is highly vulnerable. Currently, C is highly vulnerable with obligations and other defined circumstances. D is payment default on financial commitments. The best rating for a country is AAA. If a country's rating falls below A, then that country may be in financial trouble because it may find it difficult, it may find itself in a position where it cannot borrow money, or it has to borrow money at extremely high interest rates. Let's look next at the price of bonds. Bonds have an interesting way of being priced. So let's take a look and see how they are priced. The price of bond is dependent on the interest rate and the amount of the promised payment. The formula for the price of the bond is the promised payment divided by 1 plus the interest rate. Let's look at a couple of examples of using this formula. The promised payment on the bond is $100 and the interest rate is 6% or 0.06. What is the price of the bond? Well, the first thing we'd want to do is write down the formula, the promised payment divided by 1 plus the interest rate. Next, we'll substitute in 100 for the promised payment and 0.06 for the interest rate. Next, we'll add the 1 to the 0.06, which gives us 1.06. So we have 100 divided by 1.06. If we do the division, we come up with a price of $94.34. This means that an investor buys the bond at $94.34, and that gives him or her an interest rate of 6%. Let's look at another example. Once again, we're going to the promised payment on the bond is $100 and the interest rate is 10%. What is the price of the bond? Once again, we'll start out by writing down the formula, the promised payment divided by 1 plus the interest rate. Next, we'll substitute in 100 for the promised payment and 0.10 for the interest rate. Next, we're going to have 100 divided by 1.10, And if we do the math, we find out that's $90.91. What this means is the investor buys the bond at $90.91, and in 1 year he or she redeems it for $100. The promise payment on the bond is $100 and the interest rate is 2% or 0.02. What is the price of the bond? Once again, we start out by writing down the formula. The price of the bond is equal to the promise payment divided by 1 plus the interest rate. Next, we substituted $100 for the promise payment and 0.02 for the interest rate. We add 1 to the interest rate, which gives us 1.02. So our next step is 100 divided by 1.02. And if we do the math, we find that that is $98.94. What this means is that if a person buys a bond at $98.94 and in 1 year redeems it for $100, they've earned 2% interest rate on that bond. Hopefully you've noticed that there's an interesting relationship between the price of a bond and the interest rate. However, if you didn't see it, as the price of the bond increases, the interest rate decreases. So investors want to buy bonds at the lowest possible cost because that means they're getting the highest possible interest rate. Let's look at another technique that the Federal Reserve uses to manipulate the money supply, the buying and selling of bonds. The Federal Open Market Committee is a committee of the Federal Reserve which is in charge with deciding how to implement Federal Reserve policy in relation to the money supply. Remember, the ultimate goal of the Federal Reserve is stable prices with economic growth. The Federal Reserve manipulates money by buying and selling bonds to banks. Before looking at the mechanics of how the Federal Reserve System influences the money supply by buying and selling bonds, there are a few pieces of background information that might be helpful to know about the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve has a stock of government bonds which it buys from the U.S. Treasury. The Federal Reserve can encourage banks to buy bonds by increasing the interest rate, making the bonds cheaper. The Federal Reserve can discourage banks from buying bonds by decreasing the interest rate, that is, making the price of the bonds more expensive. Let's see what happens when the Federal Reserve sells bonds to the banking system. Before starting to talk about the impact of the Federal Reserve on selling bonds to the banking system, let's take a minute to review the balance sheet of a bank. As you may remember, the bank has several types of assets. First, it is required to keep reserves, which are required by law. In our example, this is $200. Second, the bank has excess reserves, $300 in our example. The bank can use the money for investments to earn a return. Up until this point, we have assumed that the bank will use most of its excess reserve for loans. However, there is nothing illegal about the bank using this money for other investments like government bonds. In this example, our bank has $700 in bonds. And finally, our bank has $800 worth of loans. Notice that the total amount of assets does equal to the amount of liabilities, so our bank is in good financial health. If the Federal Reserve System decides it wants to sell bonds to banks, it will decrease the price of bonds. Remember, decreasing the price of the bond causes the interest rate to increase and make it a better deal for the bank. In order for the bank to get the bonds, it needs to give the Federal Reserve money for the bonds. In our example, the Federal Reserve sells bonds to banks and the bank uses its excess reserves to buy the bonds. Thus, the amount of money the bank has to make to loans decreases and thus decreases the money supply in the economy. Let's look at the idea using some pictures. When the Federal Reserve sells bonds to the bank, the money supply decreases. Let's take a minute and see how the selling of bonds by the Federal Reserve impacts our money supply graph. When the Federal Reserve sells bonds to the banking system, the money supply shifts to the left. Notice that the impact of the shift to the left of the money supply curve also causes interest rates to increase. Let's see the impact of the banking system when the Federal Reserve buys bonds from the banking system. Before starting and talking about the impact of the Federal Reserve's buying bonds from the banking system, let's take a minute and review the balance sheet. As you may remember, the bank has several types of assets. First, it has its required reserves, which is required by law to hold. In our example, this is $200. Second, it has excess reserves, $50 in our example. The bank also has $950 worth of bonds and $800 in loans. If the Federal Reserve decides it wants to buy bonds from banks, it will increase the price that it is willing to pay for the bonds. Remember, increasing the price of the bonds causes the interest rate to decrease and making the bonds less attractive to hold by the bank. In order for the Federal Reserve to get the bonds, it will need to give banks money for the bonds. If the Federal Reserve decides to buy bonds from banks, the bank transfers its bonds to the Federal Reserve and gets money from the Federal Reserve. Since this money is not a deposit, the bank does not need to keep any of it on reserve, but can use it all for loans. So when the Federal Reserve buys bonds from the banking system, the money supply increases. Let's look at the representation at what's happening graphically. Let's take a minute to look at the situation graphically. When the Federal Reserve buys bonds, it transfers money to the banks. The banks then have excess reserves and the money supply increases. Let's see what happens to the money supply curve when the Federal Reserve buys bonds from the banking system. When the Federal Reserve buys bonds from the banking system, it will transfer money into the banks. The amount of excess reserves in the banks will increase, and the banking system will expand its loans to individuals and firms. The firms will cause the money supply to shift to the right, causing the equilibrium interest rate to drop. When the Federal Reserve System buys bonds from the banking system, the money supply increases because there will be more excess reserves available to banks for loans. It will also help decrease the interest rate. When the Federal Reserve sells bonds to the banking system, the money supply decreases because there will be less excess reserves available to banks for loans, and the interest rate will increase. Let's look at the impact of the federal funds rate and the discount rate on the supply of money. If a bank finds itself short of required reserves, it can borrow money it needs from other banks. The borrowing bank does not get the money for free, however. It must pay interest on the loan. The interest rate is called the federal funds rate. So if Bank A finds itself short of cash, it must borrow the money from other banks. When Bank A returns the money, it must also pay interest on the loan. If the Federal Reserve sets the federal funds rate relatively low, it is a signal to the banks to lend more freely. Suppose a bank makes a $100 loan at 10% for 24 hours. At the end of the day, it discovers that its required reserves is short $100, and so therefore it must either borrow $100 from another bank or go bankrupt. The federal funds rate is 1%, so the bank borrows $100 and the next morning pays back $101. That is $100 plus 1% to the lending bank. Later in the day, it collects the loan it made for $100, collecting 10% interest from the borrower. It has made $9 on the transaction. Notice that the penalty to the bank is relatively small for not having required reserves. Thus, a decrease in the federal funds rate allows the bank to loan more freely, causing the money supply to increase. If the Federal Reserve sets the federal funds rate relatively high, it is a signal to banks to lend less freely. Suppose a bank makes a $100 loan at 10% for 24 hours. At the end of the business day, it discovers that its required reserves is short $100, so it must borrow $100 from another bank or go bankrupt. The federal funds rate is 11%. So the bank borrows $100 and the next morning pays back $111 that is $100 plus 11%. Later in the day, it collects its loan it made for $100 at 10% from the borrower. It has lost $1 on the transaction. Notice the penalty to the bank is relatively large for not having the required reserves. Thus, an increase in the federal funds rate forces the bank to loan less freely, causing the money supply to decrease. If the Federal Reserve sets the discount relatively low, it is a signal to banks to lend more freely. Suppose a bank makes a $100 loan at 10% for 24 hours. At the end of the business day, it discovers that the required reserves is short $100. So it must either borrow $100 from the Federal Reserve or go bankrupt. The discount rate is 1%, so the bank borrows $100 and then the next morning it pays back the $101, that is $100 plus 1%. Later in the day it collects the loan it made for $100, collecting the 10% interest from the borrower. It has made $9 on the transaction. Notice the penalty for the bank is relatively small for not having the required reserves. So, a decrease in the discount rate allows the bank to loan more freely, causing the money supply to go up. If the Federal Reserve set the discount relatively high, it is a signal to banks to loan not as much. Suppose a bank makes a loan of $100 at 10% for 24 hours. At the end of the business day, it discovers that its required reserves is short $100, and it must either borrow the $100 from the Federal Reserve or go bankrupt. The discount rate is 8%, so the bank borrows $100 and the next morning pays back $108 or $100 plus 8%. Later in the day, it collects the loan it made for $100 and collects the 10% interest from the borrower of $110. So the bank has only made 2% or $2 on the loan. Notice that the penalty to the bank is relatively high for not having the required reserves. Thus, an increase in the discount rate causes the bank to loan less freely, causing the money supply to decrease. If the federal funds rate or the discount rate decreases, the money supply will increase because banks will be more likely to lend. The cost to the bank is less if they need to borrow money to make sure they have enough reserves. If the federal funds rate or the discount rate increases, the money supply will decrease because banks will find it more costly to lend. The cost of the bank will be higher if they need to borrow money to make sure they have enough reserves. The table summarizes the impact of changes in the Federal Reserve policies. If the Federal Reserve increases the reserve ratio, the money supply will shift to the left. If the Federal Reserve decreases the reserve ratio, the money supply will shift to the right. If the price of bonds bought by the Federal Reserve increases, the money supply will shift to the right. If the price of the bonds sold by the Federal Reserve decreases, the money supply will shift to the left. If the Federal Reserve buys bonds, the money supply will shift to the right. If the Federal Reserve sells bonds, the money supply will shift to the left. If the federal funds rate or the discount rate increases, the money supply will shift to the left. If the federal funds rate or the discount rate decreases, the money supply will shift to the right.